Welcome to Woke Nation. Like I said, welcome back to Woke Nation. This is May the 20th, and I think this will be the final episode on addiction. As anyone that's been paying attention, there's been a couple episodes that I've done now on my past experiences in addiction. Um, and I wanted to just to kind of go back on it a little bit. I wanted to give not only my story but also kind of why I ended up where I did, and with this episode, kind of where I'm at now and why I think I got to where I'm at now. Um, Now, in the past two episodes, I really kind of tried to focus on maybe the things that push me or help push me in a certain direction, why I ended up actually choosing to experiment with things that I knew that inevitably would not be good for me or would hurt me, why I think that I had tendencies inside of me, perhaps those addictive qualities that maybe not everybody has to one degree or another, that kind of helped push me down a certain road. Um, so I want to pick up here at the end of the last episode that I put out. I really focused in that episode on contentment and how being content and my battle to kind of find contentment played a huge part in why I think I became an addict. As I said before, there's every time I think on these things, I always seem to find one more reason of one more. A thing that pushed me towards addiction, another reason for why I became an addict. Maybe it's just another excuse, but I don't think so. I think that everything was wrong about the way I thought about the world and kind of the way I looked at life, my worldview. And if your worldview is skewed like that, if there's an absence of hope and contentment and purpose, then and a foundation, that was one of the biggest things, was a total lack of foundation. I often thought of like a ship in a storm, with no anchor. As cheesy as that kind of is, that literary and image or analogy or whatever, but it was apt. It described how I felt. So I think all of those things, but more, if you want to limit it down to a single idea, would be that lack of an anchor, lack of a foundation. That's why I always say today the number one thing I look for when I'm listening to somebody, not in casual conversation, obviously, but if I'm listening to somebody describe why like what they believe, I always look for a foundation. By what authority do you say what you believe? What is your authority for your belief? What is your proof? What is your evidence? What is your reasoning? What is your logic? All those things play into, and that's what I always look for now, because for so long I felt like I didn't have that at all. And so I'm very passionate right now, at least, about apologetics and yeah, apologetics, why a Christian believes what he or she believes. It's not just as simple as saying, well, I have faith in the Bible or I have faith in God. Anyway, to make a long story short, where I left off on the last episode, the second episode, which was on contentment, was, more or less I went into rehab for the second time. I had gone before, a year ago before that, and I didn't stay the full 30 days. I didn't really want to be there. I mainly went because I knew I was in a bad, difficult, hard situation. I had worn myself out just working around the clock to try to sustain my addiction, but I was sick and tired of that. And my tolerance was so high that I was just not getting high, and that was a very frustrating thing, because unlike a lot of other addicts, and addicts that I knew, I never used anything to just feel normal. A lot of people I knew would buy a certain quantity of substance and and dole it out to themselves in little bits, little amounts throughout the day so that they never experience withdrawal. Well, I never got involved in any of that stuff. I was all or nothing with it. I never got involved with it just to feel normal. You cannot be an addict and feel normal. You can not be an addict and not ruin your life and not throw all your money out the window and feel normal or not sick. You don't have to do these things to avoid feeling sick. So if I'm going to do them, I'm going to do them for the reason that anybody gets involved in that stuff, and that's to escape, to feel high, and to escape, you know? So I was all or nothing with it. And in fact, if you could put it succinctly, I was a purist as an addict, you know. I was a pure addict. I didn't do it as a life for the love of a lifestyle or a love of feeling normal. I did it for the very reason that you don't feel normal, for the very reason that it was a totally different lifestyle than anything else that I had experienced. So anyway, I went into rehab for the second time, and I don't want to criticize, don't mistake me when I'm criticizing or talking about my experiences in rehab. I don't, I would always suggest anybody that is suffering through addiction right now who is looking to get clean, looking to get off of drugs, I would always encourage them to go to rehab. I would never say don't go to rehab. The other options would be like locking yourself in a room and trying to go cold turkey. I have tried that before in the past, and it almost never works, especially with something like heroin, because heroin, the withdrawals are extremely intense. It's about a week of you know, hot and cold flashes, throwing up, diarrhea, restless. Your entire body gets that restless leg syndrome. You just thrash around like a wild animal, bathed in sweat at night. Extreme highs and lows in emotion. You know, very plummeting depression with irrational elation. It's just terrible. I don't know, unless you've been through it, it's really hard to describe how bad it actually is. There's a reason why addicts, you know, will do anything to get out of withdrawal. I mean, it's hell. It's as close to hell that you could go through in a privileged society like America's and not actually be in spiritual hell. I don't know how else to describe it. It's just awful. So where was I going with this? Yeah, so it's very hard for somebody to lock themselves in a room and just by pure will get off of the drug, especially if you've been using for years, because by that point your body is totally enslaved to it, and the process of returning back to any sort of real normalcy on a physical level, not to mention this your spiritual or physical, or not physical, or emotional state, takes forever as well. But it's a long process before you can sleep at night. Like withdrawal is insomnia, so just getting to a normal night's sleep takes forever, weeks and weeks and weeks of not really sleeping. Um, just your entire body is slowly changing back to what it normally is. So it's a long process. Even no matter how you go about it, it's a long process, rehab or no. So to do that just through sheer will, and that's not even describing the emotional part of it, the terrible depression, which is compounded by the fact that normally by the time you've arrived at a point in your life in your addiction where you want to quit, you've probably shall we say, burned every bridge that you can possibly bridge. Most addicts have. They've stolen from everybody. They've robbed everybody. They've cut ties and burned bridges with all those that they would consider loved ones and friends and former relative or former friends, co-workers. You've been fired from numerous jobs. You've been arrested. Your life is in shambles. So beyond the regular depression that you're going to get from withdrawal, it's further compounded by the despair of knowing that really what awaits you out there is, once you're clean, you still have to face the nightmare that you've created for yourself in your own life. I mean, that doesn't go away just because you decided to stop using drugs. Now you have to face it sober without that barrier that drugs provided in the past. It's a sick cycle that as you destroy your life further, you find more and more excuses to use drugs because you're destroying your life further, and it just goes in a cycle. You want to numb yourself to the destruction you're causing in your life and in your relationships and your family and between you and God and your neighbors and your whoever, your spouse, your siblings, everybody, your friends who are no longer your friends. And you want to numb yourself because you know you're destroying these things, and it gets worse and worse and worse as time goes on, and so your use gets worse and worse and worse, and it's just this non-ending cycle unless you choose to end it. And usually by the time that somebody chooses to end it, it's gotten pretty bad. So I would always encourage you to go to rehab. I would. That being said, I think that there's a lot of things about rehab that really should change. I think if there's any sort of, they want any sort of substantial success rate. Number one, 30 days, unless you have a very small habit and a very short time of using, 30 days is not going to cure anybody. You need at least 6 months in a place, in a facility, to really give yourself a good chance at actually getting clean. 30 days, it's something. Any kind of time away from the drug to try to clear your head is good. Any kind of clean time is good. The things, the tools, as they call them, like the 12 steps that you can learn in rehab, these things are all good, but it's not enough time. It's just not. 30 days. I don't know how anyone survives off of 30 days. It's no wonder that I think 95% of people that go through rehab relapse and are back in there. 95%. And I've heard that statistic kicked around by numerous different journalists and different magazines, different speakers. It's pretty well recognized as a solid figure. Upwards of 90% of people that go through the rehab system are going to end up back in the rehab system, especially with heroin, because heroin does really alter the molecular structure of your brain. It creates opiate receptors as your which are they release as endorphins are released by heroin. The receptors are created in your brain to I don't know how it really works. Don't look at me for any kind of scientific or biological understanding of this stuff, but I know that it creates receptors in your brain, and the larger your use, the more receptors are there, and those receptors scream for opiates. So the more receptors you have in your brain, and then you just suddenly cut off use, that's a tremendous amount of psychological and emotional and physical pain. So the longer your use and the higher your use, the more receptors, the more pain, the more suffering you're going to go through as you try to get off of the drug. So anyway, I went up to Harrisburg. Just get right into this. I went up to Harrisburg and I went into a rehab, which was called, it's a type of the first rehab I went into was a pure rehab where you go from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting all day long. And they have different variations on the meetings, the type. Some of them you share, some of them are a speaker comes in. But this one that I went into was a place called Common Ground, and it was right on the Front Street, right by the river. And it's what they call a therapeutic community. Pure rehabs I don't generally have a problem with, but I do have some beef with therapeutic communities. Now, I took what I could from this place. When I went in there, as I said before, I openly admitted, I need to change. What I've been doing is wrong. No matter whether I agree with this place or not, I'm going to just do what they say and see where it leads, because my way of doing things does not work. So I knew that. And I kept that mentality through the entire time I was at Common Ground. I bit the bullet and said, I don't care what they say, whether I like it or not, I'm going to go with it. That being said, if you're going to go into rehab, I would suggest going into doing it, and you have a choice. I would suggest going into a pure rehab rather than a therapeutic community. The therapeutic community, uh, they intentionally, and this is true, whether it's not just me saying it, they intentionally push your buttons while you're there to get you to respond in an irrationally emotional way, so that they teach you. The whole point of it is to push your buttons so that you learn how to deal with situations in life. As opposed to the very short fused emotional responses that you typically gave that they believe led you into an addiction. So the staff there is sort of aggressive and sort of confrontational, and they do intentionally push your buttons and do things that they think will set you off. They encourage conflict in a sense, not physical, but they put the patients, the addicts, in a big room together, and you're basically in that room the entire day without relief. Every once in a while, they'll line you up and hand out cigarettes so you can go outside and smoke. But for the most part, you're in this room all day long with 30 other people, some of whom are still withdrawing from heroin. The detox period at these places usually lasts about a week, and then you're released from what. You're released from, you're not considered detox anymore. You're part of the regular rehab community. But the therapeutic model, it was run by a man named Warren there. I forget his full name, but is Warren somebody or another. And he wrote a whole pamphlet on his why the therapeutic community model as a rehab. And I think there are all sorts of things that are wrong with it. Beyond just the confrontational nature of the staff, the intentional structure of the place to frustrate you and try to get you to lash out in irrationally emotional ways, and then punish you. All of this is designed to elicit negative responses from you during a period where you are withdrawing from heroin. So they're putting people in a room, some of which have only been clean a couple hours and are still in detox and still withdrawing from heroin, and then blaming them when the staff instigates negative responses from them, then blaming them for giving that negative response. They do things that I think are incredibly demeaning to adults. I've seen the staff scream in the faces of some of the patients, calling them liars, or one of the ladies called another, a grown man, a smartass, and then made him go down to the hall and sit in a chair staring at the wall for an hour. These are adults. Not the staff I'm talking about, but the staff lady did this to an adult man. That's unthinkable in my book. I mean, you don't treat adults that way, especially that are withdrawing off of heroin, and then wonder and tell them that they're to blame, that it's your addiction that is the problem when they flare up in anger at being talked to that way, called a smart A. I don't want to curse or any, what she said. Very wrong, in my opinion. Any sort of negative, they would encourage. There was things like on Tuesdays where they had the confrontation box where they encouraged you to find things about people that were annoying you around you, or confrontation, and then they would open the box and one person would have to pull up a chair and then read their confrontation. I forget, I think it was called Confrontation Tuesday or something like that, and you would have to confront this person. Now, I guess the idea is learning how to work through your emotions and how to genuinely confront another person without lashing out and wanting to shoot them, I guess, like you would normally in the streets. I just thought that was the normal way to do it. You just get your gun. This guy annoyed me, I'm going to blow his head off. It turns out that that's not normal. Who knew? But, like, it just seemed to me like a very wrong way to deal with people that are number one, adults, to treat them like children like that by making them sit in a chair, and they called it the hard chair, in timeout. Like, these are 30-year-olds. I was 30 when I went in there. I was speechless when that lady made that grown man sit in a chair down at the end of the hall and stare at the wall. I was like, is this really even happening? I don't, and that, to punish people, they put them on cleaning pots and pans, uh, all day long for endless days. And I got put on that one time because a girl sat down at my table. She just sat there. That's all she did. Now, girls and guys are separated there. There's no, what do they call it? What did they call it? They called it, no fraternizing. And don't fraternize, which I understand. They should separate them. They should just solve the whole problem by having men's rehabs and female rehabs. Rehab is not a time for men and women to be getting together while they're withdrawing off drugs, knowing that a lot of the people that were addicts on the streets, got their drugs through doing things of a sexual nature, and then to put people like that who are still struggling with some of those events and maybe temptations, and are still struggling with the mentality that sex can get you things, and then put them together at a time like that of great stress and agony in their lives, I think is a very wrong thing to do. I think it encourages wrong behavior. It is not indicative towards recovery in any stretch of the mind. It's just encouraging people to fall into temptation and do things they shouldn't do. Um, that being said, when I was there, I met somebody, and this person happens to be who I'm with now. Now, of course, when we were in there, we didn't, we just talked here and there, and we just kind of, in the very little way that you possibly can in a rehab, like got to know each other a little bit, like who she was, who I am. We talked. They would take us out for long walks along the river sometimes, and we would kind of hang back and just talk, and we kind of got to know each other a little bit that way. And I guess the saying is true that when you meet the person that you know that you're going to love and be with forever, then you just know there's just something there that you've never had meeting anybody else. And that's how it was. I mean, we both say that, we both acknowledge it. And it is a great thing, but I want to emphasize, extremely rare that any of those they call them rehab romances. And I myself would not, I didn't go in there and think like I'm going to meet somebody in here. I had no sort of idea that that was going to take place. I was not looking at anybody there in that way. Because I knew that that's not the place for it. You're not in rehab to meet somebody to fall in love with, or to be in a relationship with. The counselors and everybody warned us against it, and I would warn anybody else against it, generally speaking. I know of one other couple that was in there, and I'll keep them confidential. I don't really talk to them anymore, but while they were in there, it was kind of me and my wife, and those two who were the counselors and the staff there were always trying to separate me and my wife. We weren't, obviously, she wasn't my wife or my fiance at the time, and this other couple, because we were always fraternizing, always trying to talk, and there was obvious interest between me and her and this couple also. I understand why they were concerned, the staff, I do. And I would never encourage anybody to think that a rehab is a place to build a relationship, or to look for a spouse, or look for somebody to fall in love with, or look for somebody to be in a relationship with, or even to hook up with. For one thing, since a lot of people do a lot of desperate, nasty things for their drugs, you don't know where this guy or girl, if you're, you don't know where they've been sexually. You just have no idea. So you got to be very careful about that, number one. I would never encourage promiscuity, first off, just because I think you should, generally be married before you have sex. But if that's going to happen, you should be aware that many of the people in there have done some pretty gnarly things for their drugs, guys and girls. So that's one. Number two, you're not in any sort of emotional state to pick a spouse, or you don't even, at that point in your life when you're in rehab coming off of drugs, you don't even know who you are, much less they know who they are. There, if you're going to be with somebody for the rest of your life, you should be able to offer of yourself. But if you don't even know who you are, how can you do that? And the same can be said for them as well. How can you give of yourself if yourself has been emptied, destroyed, and shattered by a drug, and you're still trying to put yourself back together? Not to mention the temptations that would arise. If you, especially two addicts who have been addicted to the same substance, uh, it just stands to reason that in times of difficulty or whatever, that if they're tempted, if your spouse is tempted, that will make it a lot easier for them to get you to fall as well. Or if they fall and you see it, it's much easier for you to fall. So the temptation there is greater, I think, and the risk is greater. And for that reason, I would never suggest it. Now, there is a flip side to that where you could say that two addicts who love each other and care about each other, it's complementary and a good foundation, because if you're struggling and you're tempted to go do something, go get high or something, then they understand where you're coming from and can really encourage you and, be a good moral support and, help you get back on the right track and say, no, you know where this leads. I know where it leads. There's that understanding there. They've been there. And so, and also, an addict who's married to or dating somebody who's never experienced addiction, there is going to be a sense that your wife, that somebody who you should be able, or your husband, it doesn't matter, who you should be able to confide in totally, just isn't going to understand really. And so that shame sometimes that an addict feels when they're struggling with temptation or wanting, afraid they're going to relapse, or they're having cravings, there's a sense of shame that you can get from that too. And if somebody hasn't experienced addiction, you're a lot less likely to share that with them, because number one, you don't think they'll understand really. They may say they understand, and lots of people will say they understand, but unless you've been there, you don't really understand. It's just the hard truth of it. Unless you've been through it, you really don't understand what it's like to, as William S. Burroughs put it, somebody who's not an addict can never really understand what it is, for an addict to need his drug with the special addict's need. That's just how Burroughs put it, and I think it's very apt. What William S. Burroughs called the algebra of addiction, the algebra of need, the face of total need. He wrote about it very, very vividly. For anyone who's read Burroughs, I wouldn't recommend reading Burroughs. He's very vulgar, but addiction's a vulgar thing. So if you want to know what addiction's really like, read Naked Lunch or read Junkie by William S. Burroughs. He pulls no punches. So yeah, while we were there at Common Ground, we met, my fiance and I, and my wife, and we were under a lot of suspicion from the staff because we were constantly talking in the halls, and they weren't happy about it by any measure, of course. And then when I got out, I knew that I didn't want to go home, whether I had met her or not. Now there was a part of me that because I met her, I wanted to stay up around Harrisburg and just see where it went with her. But I had already planned, even before meeting her or any of that, to stay up around Harrisburg, because the three things they talk about in addiction, if you want to get clean, is your environment, the people around you, and the things that your habits. People, places, things is what they call it. And so I knew that from past experience that if I wanted any real shot at getting clean, I had to leave where I grew up, because to me there was not a road that was in my area where I grew up that I didn't buy drugs on or use drugs on or do this or do that. Everything about it I associated with that lifestyle. So I knew I had to stay up there and just start over completely. So I went into a spiritual recovery home um, called Daystar, which was in the middle of the city of Harrisburg, not in a very good area. And I was there for 3 months. And it's a house, it's a halfway house. You're there with like 14 other guys, 14, 15 other guys. There's staff that's always there. I don't know if they sleep there. I don't think the staff sleeps there. I don't think so. Somebody does. Well, there's a guy that stays through the night. They always have somebody there on call, on staff, watching. And you can only leave. You get time off, kind of on the weekends where you sign out and you can be gone, but you have to be back at a certain time. So she and I would hang out, go to the movies or whatever on the weekends, and there was one phone in the place, and so you had like 30 minutes. Each person had 20, 30 minutes in the evening where they could make a call. So I would call her, she would get off work, I would call her. So we stayed in touch and we kind of built a relationship that way and got to know each other better. We would go to the movies on the weekends, go out to eat, do this, do that. Meanwhile, I'm going through this program that they have there, and it's a spiritual program. In the mornings, they had Bible study, and it didn't come at the Bible from any specific theological point of view, but more the love of God, the hope of God, which are not negative things in any way, shape, or form. But it was all just, very positive about giving up sin and that kind of thing. It wasn't bad. I thought it was pretty good. And it was helpful, very helpful. Um, but I didn't know really what to think about it. When I came out of rehab, even though I had given up in a lot of ways, I didn't know what to put in its place. So I had felt like a ship with no anchor. I had no foundation for years and years and years. But I still didn't when I went into Daystar. Even though I knew I had sinned and I had repented, I still was like very much very conflicted, not knowing, where am I going to go? Who am I going to be? I had no sense of self, no identity. It's like you're shattered, like somebody throws a brick through a glass window, and then it's your job to fit every little tiny piece and shard of glass back together and make that into a whole window again, just like it was before. That's how hard it is to put yourself back together completely like that. Um, it was hard, and there's lots of just like pure insanity where you feel like you're going crazy in your head. And I was seeing counselors during this time. They're trying to help me through things, depression, anxiety. I had a sense of the world being futile for a long time there because I just didn't have a direction. Okay, now I went through rehab. Now what? So it's hard to describe how crazy a feeling it is to really rebuild yourself after it's been destroyed completely. Um, but I mean, I think looking back on it all, I see that there was a lot of purpose there. I like the analogy, the picture that many people, pastors, have drawn of a set of footprints in the sand, and it's only on looking back that you see another set of footprints that was always walking along beside yours, but you never saw them while you were first going there. It's only on looking back that you can see that second set of footprints, which is God's. It's not a perfect analogy, but looking back, I see a lot of how, a purpose there, even though it didn't feel like it at the time. So after the halfway house, then I moved into a recovery house, and I was there another 3 months. During the time at the recovery house is when my wife got pregnant with our first child. His name is Lucas. But obviously not planned, and it was obviously not the ideal thing or the right thing to do. And this is partly why they really come down on rehab romances, because you should, when you're rebuilding yourself like that, be focusing on yourself and fixing your life, and really, it's not the time to be then worried about somebody having your child. It's just not. So I don't want to, go into too much detail as far as her side of things because that's personal and private to her. But she was in a lot of very stressful situations herself around the time that she got pregnant. And so the only reason I really bring this up is because I had moved into a recovery house where basically I could do whatever I wanted. You know, I could do it. There was no authority structure there. They had no rules. You could come and go as you wanted. You just paid the guy rent. It was a flop house. It was a total dump. They had no working kitchen. There was no place to cook food. I had a microwave in my room that somebody had given to me, and that was about it. I mean, it was about as low as it gets as far as living quarters, and it was right in the heart of the ghetto, where there were people outside all the time selling drugs and offering you drugs. And I had money too, or at least money available to me. I didn't have a lot. You know, I was living off of unemployment at the time because I had worked before going into rehab. But that, and when she got pregnant and everything, that was actually looking back on it, that was the absolute most stressful time in my entire life. And I think that that was used again, looking back, 2020, hindsight is 2020. Looking back, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to go into her personal side of things, but suffice it to say that there was a lot of things going on with her pregnancy that really were not healthy and were not safe, and really made me, because I believe that from the moment of conception, it's a child. So I really did think of Lucas, who I didn't know his name was Lucas or he was even a he, but I thought of the child inside of her the same way I think about Lucas now. You know, it was instantaneous. The moment we found out she was pregnant, I thought of that as just her child, my child, our child, from the very moment, the very second. And so my instinct, I guess, for protecting that child was the same as knowing Lucas now and not letting him cross the street in front of traffic. You know, that same instinct, that same desire to protect, to care for, to love, all those things. And so all the things that were going on with her, private though I'll keep them for this, put me under an enormous amount of stress. And, you know, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't think about anything else. I was working at Amazon briefly for about a month there. Um, but that's what I say. Looking back on it, 2020, um, I think that, and this is where a lot of people question, how can God allow bad things to happen? How can He allow suffering? How can He allow evil? Well, I can only speak from my perspective, and I have my own theological beliefs about that, which we can talk about in some other episode. But so, looking back, I think that it is true what the Bible says, that He uses all things to the good of those who love Him and keep His commandments. Now, I was not living and had not been living a life to be proud of or to say that is how a Christian should live. I was sinning. This is where also the mercy and the grace of God is very important, because without it, I wouldn't even be sitting here right now. I want to emphasize that above all else. You know, anyone that listens to this should be aware that there is absolutely nothing that separates me between anybody that has overdosed or is in jail right now, except for the grace of God. That is it. I do not have a superhuman liver. I don't have superhuman kidneys. I don't have superhuman veins or anything within inside of me. I don't have a superhuman tolerance for drugs, and yet I've taken quantities that have killed everybody around me and not me. The only thing that has kept me here is the grace of God. That is it. If you take anything from this podcast, take that. I believe that as surely as I see the sun in the sky above me. Not literally right now. There's a light bulb over there for the sake of light, um, but as I was saying about circumstance, I think he used what was an extremely stressful pregnancy, at least the first trimester, um, it left me, because of the stress, because I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't think about anything else. All my waking thoughts were just like on what was going on with her and our child, and getting her out of a bad situation, and what kind of impact this was going to have on the pregnancy. Was it going to be a miscarriage? All these kinds of things. Enormous amounts of stress. Looking back, I see that God used a negative situation to force me, to give me no other choice but to trust Him. Because, you know, it's very easy to say, oh, I don't need to trust God. Oh, I can do this. Oh, I can do that. Or the flip side of that, which is to say, oh, I trust God, you know. But it really matters when the chips are down. That's when you find out whether you believe something or not. And rather than fall into absolute despair, I was given absolutely no choice but to just pray and trust. Otherwise, I would have lost my mind. And so I see things like that, these little things, and it's why I said in another episode that I think that God working in my life, at least, some people have a strike of lightning. You see the Apostle Paul in on the road to Damascus, knocked off his horse and blinded, and immediately saying, "Who are you, Lord?" Um, I've had moments not like that at all, but things happen. But I think of myself and my situation, the way I believe he's worked in my life is very incremental. Little things and situations like I just described with the pregnancy, just over time, forcing me, giving me no other option, where anything else would have driven me insane or just not been. I had no choice but to trust him, none other. There was nothing else I could do. What else could I do? Where there was nowhere else to turn. I had exhausted all of that. People were sick of listening to me, and they had no answers anyway, kind though they were to listen. Um, yeah, I, that was a positive that came out of that. Now, anyone who knows me knows that in the long run, by God's mercy, things turned out all right. Lucas is doing just fine. Um, he drives me crazy every single day. He's here. Believe me, he's here. He was born, and he'll be 4 in September. So the nightmare continues. Anyway, um, so yeah, and then eventually I got it moved out of the recovery house, and we got a small place in a place called Steelton, Pennsylvania, which is we lived in a place that had didn't have a working toilet in it. We had to go into another apartment because this was a condemned building that somebody allowed us to stay in and charged us $75 a week to stay in. We had to go into another building. He had given us a key to go into his apartment that he never lived in. This is the guy that owned the place, because the toilet in ours didn't work, or actually, I don't even think it was there. The shower was like a tub with a hose fed into it, into a head at the top. Uh, the place was falling apart. There was drywall that was just not there throughout the entire place. The floor was caved in, the ceiling was caved in. Um, and that's where we were for an entire summer. A large part of that being finances, that we just couldn't afford to move into another place. I was working at a construction company, but there was a lot going on. We'll just put it that way. And yeah, from there we finally did get an apartment in Mechanicsburg, and that's where things kind of return to a more normal life. And it was when we moved into Mechanicsburg that we find Jen had Lucas, at the hospital, and he was born healthy. We had some trouble with because of certain things, the medication she was on, with him being kept in NICU with withdrawal and everything, because they had to make sure he was okay, because she was on medication that could cause babies to withdraw, I guess, after they're born. So there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff like that. One thing that we noticed right after he was born was two little dents, like right here above his eyebrows, like caved in, like right here. Am I doing that right? Right here. And the doctors at first tried to tell us that that's just his head. Babies' heads kind of get elongated or smushed a little bit when they come out of the womb, when they're born, because they come through the what is it, the uterus wall? No, the tunnel. Head towards the light. Um, so their head has to go back to its normal shape over time. But what they found actually, as his head didn't go back to normal, was that babies have these little soft spots in their skulls, and that those soft spots are are the skull, the bones not being fused together, which allows the brain to grow over time. Now, his forehead right here had fused together inside of the womb, and so um, over time, and as time progressed, you could look down at his head from above, and it was getting like triangular right here because the right here it fused together, and so over time, this would cause a lot of problems as far as brain growth and development. So they determined that the only way around it was to perform surgery. Otherwise, he would suffer brain problems and be deformed. So at 6 months old, he had to have basically brain surgery or surgery on his skull, where they took out this part of his skull right here between my two fingers, take that out and bend it to the shape that it should be in that would allow for his brain to grow. Now, the reason that it had to be done at 6 months is because if you wait beyond 6 months, then the bones actually harden and you can't bend them. They're not malleable anymore, or bendable, whatever word you want to use. But at 6 months and prior, they are. So it had to be done pretty quickly. It wasn't a few months after he was born. This was happening about 6 months. Which was another huge thing, of stress and, what's going to happen. I mean, any kind of mistake or mess up whatsoever, and he could have tremendous complications. I mean, that's your brain right there. He could have deformities if they make a mistake. He could be, and I use this word in the proper sense, retarded if they made a mistake. There could be a whole host of issues. He could die. Who knows? So that was another event where it was just like being forced absolutely to trusting God, because who else are you going to rely on that point? You're trusting in doctors who have skills and everything, but they're fallible men that can make mistakes. So no choice at all but to rely on God. So little things like that. Well, that was not a little thing, and neither was her pregnancy. But things like that were used in little ways, incrementally, to just bring me slowly back and rebuild, faith and trust. And over time, I think I saw a lot of wisdom in the fact that God provided a rehab up in Harrisburg for me to come to, not only to protect me from going back into the normal places where I had done a lot of things I shouldn't, it would have made it harder to stay sober, but to go up to Harrisburg where it was a new place, a place to start over completely, and also to start over in a sense spiritually, because a lot of the things from my past had become a stumbling block, as I talked about in other episodes. Spiritually too, some of the issues I had with Calvinism and some of the legalistic type of things I saw in Calvinism, which I'm not going to get into right here, but they have become a big stumbling block spiritually. When I looked into the Bible, I didn't really see God. Instead, I saw like the way the church had told me to see this, just this legalistic. I saw like angry, always angry God. And some of that is my own problems too, my lack of understanding, my lack of trust. I'm not laying the blame all onto the church or anything, or the way I was raised or any of that kind of stuff. But I see a purpose there in that, in coming up to Harrisburg and being given that time in rehab, 30 days in there, 3 months in the recovery house, 3 months in the halfway house, all this time, that when I started being brought back to what I believed originally, it was almost as if I was seeing it anew, brand new. The way of looking at it before that had been a stumbling block, where I couldn't see past these issues, like Calvinism, or which I still believe, by the way, and don't get me wrong, but the way it had been presented to me by a lot of different people had provided a major stumbling block. And so that time um, had enabled me to open the Bible and read it in a new way, so that stumbling block really wasn't there anymore. Not so much. I still struggle with it here and there, but not to the degree where it was debilitating like I did before, where it caused all sorts of doubt and an inability to really grow or any of that kind of stuff. It really was a major problem, and given that those several months away from it, where I'm not going to say it's a good thing to not read the Bible. It's not. It's a bad thing. You should. But even in things that I did that weren't right, I saw that they were used for good, and I think that was used for good too. Because now that I've come back to it, it's like looking at it with a fresh set of eyes, a fresh perspective, and all of a sudden things are jump out at you that maybe you had heard so many times before and you had become kind of numb to, and now they have fresh meaning and vitality and purpose. Um, it's a really good thing, and it's exciting, and it's encouraging. To it has to be encouraging. I mean, how could it be anything else than to go through all that and still even be sitting here sharing a story on a podcast and have a family and a house and a lot of blessings that normally I wouldn't have and shouldn't have in a lot of ways. So you can look back on that and reflect and say, well, this is the definition of grace, being given things that I just clearly don't deserve, a second chance, which I clearly don't deserve. I didn't earn it in any way, shape, or form, in any measure. I knew I was given light. I knew what was right, and I chose to do what was wrong anyway. You don't deserve anything but judgment at that point, and yet I was spared from it. So I mean, there's a like the prodigal son. That's how I feel a lot of the times. Sometimes my favorite prayer or picture of salvation I can almost not even describe how um how much I enjoy, or that's not the right word, how important, I guess, or how powerful, I guess, would be the word. The thief on the cross is to me. How what does he say there when he's next to Jesus dying? He doesn't. He says to him, "Remember me, Jesus, when you enter your kingdom." But and I might be reading more into it than is really there, but there's a side to me that I really look at the words that he says. Remember me, Jesus, when you enter your kingdom. It's almost as if he doesn't even feel himself worthy to ask, can I come with you? It's this remember me. And I could be wrong, but there's just, to me, a lot of humility there and a deep knowledge of unworthiness. That he's not saying, bring me with you when you go to your kingdom, or let's both be in paradise together, you and I, after we die on these crosses. Now it's just this, it's a hope. That's what I see it as. It's just a hope, that I know that you're perfect and I'm not, and I'm unworthy and you are worthy. And when I die, I deserve whatever I get, and you're going to your kingdom where you belong, to reign. Um, he doesn't even feel worthy to ask, can I come with you? It's just remember me. That's how I see it, and I could be wrong. There may be some people that have read, maybe the translation is what throws it off, and I'm reading it wrong, and that's not what he's saying at all. But that's how I see it, is that it's such a deep knowledge of unworthiness that he doesn't even ask, can I go with you? It's just remember me. I that's powerful. Um, and or there's the parable, I guess, that Jesus tells, who is judged more worthy before God, the man who stands out in the middle of the street praying as loud as he can for all to see, or the man who stands in the corner so that nobody can see him and won't even look to the heavens, but beats his chest and says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Won't even dare to look up towards the sky. Um, I wonder about theology sometimes. There's things I go back and forth on: predestination, free will. You can debate these things till the end of the day. But the one thing that I'll never doubt is grace and mercy and my unworthiness. And without grace and without mercy, I wouldn't even be sitting here, much less making a video to tell my story such that it is in a podcast or anywhere else. So that hopefully at least is an encouragement that there is, second chance and grace and redemption. And you can plummet to the absolute depths of sin, and yet that shows how deep God's grace, Christ's grace, His mercy is. Limitless, honestly. And for that we should be thankful, very thankful. So, yeah. Well, I've taken up enough of your time. I hope I've been somewhat clear about, why I am where I am right now and how I got here in these past 3 episodes. Given, hopefully, if anybody's out there that's, really struggling with addiction, I would never say don't go to rehab. I would say go to rehab. Maybe don't go to a therapeutic community, but if that's the only place that they offer you, go there, and put your pride on the back burner, because your pride has gotten you right where you are, which is looking for help. Your way will not lead you on your own. You will not be the driver of the vehicle of success. If you were, you wouldn't be using drugs. Very, very few people use drugs because they're successful and happy and where they want to be. So keep that in mind. And remember that denial and self-deception are about as powerful as anything else that's out in this world that is evil. Don't listen to that side of yourself that says, you can go tomorrow, because as the Bible says, you fool, and I don't mean this in an insulting way, but your soul might be demanded of you tonight. You don't know. You could take that last shot tonight and be gone. So it's not worth it. It really isn't. No matter what you tell yourself, when I was going through it, when I was going through rehab, when I was going through the halfway houses and the recovery houses, I never knew, whether I would ever arrive at a point where there was a purpose to life, or any kind of hopeful way of looking at life, or any reason to go on the next day. I had no idea whether I was going to get to that point ever one day, or whether I would ever, be where I'm sitting right now, content. I never thought, I never had a conception of that in my mind. The only thing I did through the entire process was just kind of put my head down like a bull and just push forward. No matter what, I just pushed forward. And that's the only way to really get through it, is just to talk to people around you, pray about it, and just push forward. Don't give up, because giving up is just, it's like what they say, and I used to always laugh at the little slogans and catchphrases that they offer in recovery at the 12-step programs. One is too many, 1,000 is never enough. But what they say is very true. Addiction will always lead to jails, institutions, and death. It's true. Inevitably, on a long enough timeline, you're either going to die from an overdose or get shot in the streets or something like that. You're going to end up insane in a mental institution with psychiatric problems that are irreversible, or you're going to end up in jail for the rest of your life, or for years. Even if it's not for the rest of your life, do you really want to throw your life away down the drain just for selling a few bags on the street or for buying them? There's more out there than that, trust me. All right. Well, that wraps up this. There'll be weekly episodes still forthcoming. And as you can see, I'm going to be trying to film all of them. So, anyway, good night and God be with you.